Hello, this is Kylie with Fem and Flow. I hope everyone's having a beautiful day. So, today we're doing part two of the architecture of distortion and the return of divine tone. So, in part one, we went over a lot of the architecture beneath this illusion and talked about the scaffolding of the false light and the grid that keeps distortion running. So, we're going to continue on that today. And like I mentioned in the first episode, we are not decoding this to fight it, we're decoding it to dissolve it. This isn't fear, it's frequency clarity. And this is to liberate you. Because once you see the blueprint clearly, you're free to choose something else. And yes, some of this is heavy, but only until it's named. Clarity is sovereignty, and the more clearly you can see the architecture, the less it can run you. So let's spiral into it. In part one, we talked about Archons. We talked about what they are, how they fit in with this big picture of what's going on here, and how the Archonic grid is what I've been calling in previous episodes the fourth dimensional false matrix. So we just dove into deeper what that actually means, the scaffolding of it all, and how it all works. So today we're going to continue with this concept of archons. So I know it might bring a little fear up when we talk about archons. It seems a little scary, but don't let it frighten you. But let's start out with talking about, can archons infiltrate a coherent field? And this is one of the most important distinctions to understand. Archons cannot infiltrate a truly coherent white hole stabilized field. They operate through resonance-based access. That means they don't barge in through force, they slip in through subtle agreement. They need a crack, an opening, a vulnerability. So if your field is unified, anchored in love, and aligned with source frequency, they can't get in. You might feel them try to ping your field, like a flicker of doubt or a whisper of pressure, but it won't stick. Because their access depends on matching your frequency, and once you're living from your true tone, they're no longer a match. But here's the nuance. Even quote unquote spiritual people still have openings. It's not about what you believe, it's about what your field is broadcasting. Here are some common entry points for archonic influences: chronic self-doubt, shame spirals, victim identities, obsession with hierarchy, status, or savior figures, unprocessed trauma, and over-identification with thoughts, especially fear-based ones. So yes, we've all heard an archon chirp at some point. They're the classic archetype of that little voice on your shoulder, whispering doubt, fear, shame, or control. That devil on one side voice, that's not just a myth, it's frequency architecture. But here's the part I want you to really hear. We don't need to be afraid of these things. Archons aren't powerful. They're parasites. Frequency ticks. Are they slippery? Sure. Are they clever in distortion? At times. But are they stronger than you? Never. They don't have creative force. They don't have hearts. They don't have access to source. They don't even have free will. They are loops, inversions, programs that run on the illusion of your consent. They need you to believe they're powerful. They need you to fear them, because that fear is the gateway. But once you see them clearly, like a tick crawling up your leg, you don't scream and spiral. You recognize the interference, clear the loop, and move on. That's how you deal with archons. Don't dramatize them. Don't romanticize them. Don't build an identity around fighting darkness. Just recognize the loop, reclaim your tone, and walk in your truth. Because once you're broadcasting white hole coherence, they short circuit on contact. You're not here to be haunted. You're here to remember. But I know for some this may sound easier than it is. And this is important because sometimes the most dangerous chirps are the quietest. Archons feed on despair. They feed on isolation. They whisper into fragmentation. Thoughts like, you don't matter, you'll never get out, you're broken, no one sees you, it would be easier if you just disappeared. These aren't your thoughts. These are invasive frequencies, telepathic downloads that slip in during moments of vulnerability. They ride the waves of unprocessed trauma, nervous system collapse, and spiritual disconnection. And the more someone believes them, the tighter the archonic grip becomes. Not because the person is weak or flawed, but because their field is fragmented just enough for something external to sneak in and start posing as internal truth. This is why trauma healing isn't optional. It's essential. Because when you reclaim your coherence, when you reconnect your light body, when you stabilize your vertical current, the chirps can't land. And the truth of who you are, the light that you carry, is why it happened. Not because you're weak, but because your light matters that much. That's how powerful your light is. But that's also how strategic this system is. Archonic forces don't always show up as shadows in the room. They show up as quiet despair that doesn't feel like yours. And when you realize that, you stop mistaking distortion for truth. You stop feeding the loop, and you begin returning to the voice of your soul. Now let's get into the role of bloodlines and contracts. This gets us talking about the elite. They are not inherently evil, but many are vessels. They descend from the original earthbound light architects who became entangled in the experiment and began building systems of control. Not from pure malice, but from amnesia and fragmentation. They forgot who they were. And in that forgetting, they partnered with Archonic intelligences. So, what does that actually mean? To partner with Archonic intelligences doesn't mean shaking hands with a visible being. It means aligning your energetic field with inversion. It means making unconscious or conscious agreements to exchange soul memory for synthetic power. It means allowing parasitic patterns to animate your creations, your rituals, and your worldview. These aren't partnerships like we think of in human terms. They're vibrational fusions, where a soul, in forgetting its true nature, begins to host distortion as if it were truth. The Archons offer illusion in exchange for influence. They amplify projection while severing divine connection. And once a soul accepts that exchange, whether in ritual, lineage, or silent consent, they become conduits for the grid. And this is where the Luciferian agenda and satanic undercurrent begin to thread in. Luciferian frequency glorifies sovereignty distorted into separation. It promotes synthetic light over divine coherence, brilliance without embodiment. It's the energetic tone of I am God, not as a realization of oneness, but as a rebellion against divinity. Satanism, in its darker ritualistic forms, is the applied architecture of that frequency. Power through inversion, creation through desecration, and control through fear. Not all who align with the Luciferian current are overtly satanic, but both systems are energetically interwoven. Luciferianism is the philosophical framework. Satanism is often the ritual arm. and both are fueled by Archonic inversion. But this goes even deeper. Now let's talk about the 13 bloodlines and the Archons and how they have a symbiotic structure of control. So, the bloodlines are the physical hosts. They are biological vessels bred and programmed over centuries to maintain power, enforce hierarchy, control resources, infiltrate religious, financial, political, and educational systems, and appear human but act as control nodes. But what most don't see is this: they're not operating alone. They are possessed, guided, or controlled by non embodied archonic intelligence that feed through them. Here's the second thing to remember: Archons do not incarnate, they interface. Archons are not physical beings, they are sentient code, parasitic distortion fields that require hosts to operate in 3D. So they enter bloodline genetics that are emotionally detached and trauma conditioned, install thought forms, false hierarchies, and power addiction, and feed on global fear, war, and suppression, and use the bloodlines to generate more. This is why these families worship inversion, like pedophilia, blood rituals, sacrifice, mind control, and domination masked as divine right. These aren't random acts of darkness. They're strategically designed frequencies used to sustain archonic inversion. And these bloodlines are hybridized by design. Many in the 13 lineages are partly reptilian or genetically modified to lack empathy, hold psychic control fields, interface with lower fourth dimensional and archonic realms, and be resistant to typical spiritual awakening. These families were designed to be frequency stable enough to carry Archon code, but human looking enough to remain hidden. They often perform emotions, spiritual beliefs, or benevolence, but their field feels cold, hollow, predatory, mimicked, and unsettling even when smiling. So here's the pyramid of control, and this is these bloodlines I'm talking about, plus the Archons. So the highest level of it is Archonic code, and these are non-embodied and parasitic control intelligence. And then under that, you have the 13 bloodlines, and these are the genetically engineered biological hosts. And then under the 13 bloodlines, you have the global systems of domination. And this is the government, religion, media, education, and finance. And then under that, you have the collective field. And the collective field is kept in fear, distraction, dependency, and distortion. And you might be asking why the bloodlines serve the Archons. And this is because they are conditioned to believe they are superior. They are promised power and immortality. They fear their own annihilation if the control structure collapses. And many are born into energetic contracts they do not understand or question. And some never question the system. Some are fully aware, even practicing dark rituals to maintain their power. And a few very rarely awaken and defect, but are usually targeted or silenced. And I talked about the bloodlines and the Archons and their symbiotic relationship at the beginning, or I mentioned it. But the Archons need the bloodlines, but the bloodlines also need the Archons. And this is the core vulnerability in their system. Because Archons cannot create, heal, love, innovate, or channel source. They rely on bloodlines to mimic structure, enforce systems, and keep the collective just asleep enough not to notice. But once the bloodlines lose influence, or when enough souls awaken and reclaim frequency, the entire pyramid begins to collapse. That's what's happening now. So I know I kind of went over this briefly, but why do these families continue and why do they think this is okay? Like I mentioned already, many of them have been raised in closed systems where this worldview is normalized. They are indoctrinated from birth into secrecy, spiritual hierarchy, and the belief that they are chosen or elite. Within their insulated circles, inversion isn't seen as corruption, it's seen as power. They believe they are preserving sacred knowledge, but that knowledge has been inverted. They believe they are carrying divine legacy, but that legacy has been hijacked by parasitic frequency. And as I mentioned earlier, these aren't isolated humans acting with full awareness. There are energetic systems, architectures, and intelligences working through them. And a key part of that legacy is religion. Judaism, Christianity, and the Roman Catholic Church each carried original streams of divine remembrance, but over time, many of their structures were co opted by bloodline families who embedded inversion into their frameworks. What began as teachings of unity, embodiment, and direct source communion became entangled with systems of hierarchy, sacrifice, shame, and control. Even the Roman Catholic Church, though founded through layers of political and energetic distortion, ritualized fragments of divine remembrance. It absorbed sacred codes from earlier teachings, but funneled them through control based architecture. The result? A structure that still carries emotional and spiritual resonance for many, but one wrapped in guilt, fear, and dependency. The original teachings of Jesus or Yeshua and Mary Magdalene were not spared. Their message of embodied divinity, sacred union, and direct connection with Source was stripped of frequency, retranslated through distortion, and repackaged as dogma. Mary Magdalene, carrier of the divine feminine template, was inverted into a symbol of shame. Her priestess codes were suppressed, rewritten, and removed from public record, while the church elevated distorted savior archetypes and severed the feminine from her rightful place in the living trinity of creation. The 12 tribes of Israel originally referred to soul lineages carrying divine harmonic codes. Symbolically, they also map to deeper layers of sacred architecture, the 12 strands of DNA, the 12 energetic chakras, and the 12-point grid of divine embodiment. These teachings were never meant to be merely genealogical. They were cosmological. They encoded how the human form mirrors the divine template. But over time, these codes were inverted, used to justify separation, elitism, and bloodline-based entitlement. The word Israel itself carries deep vibrational meaning. Is stands for the feminine principle, intuitive knowing, inner sanctuary. Ra is the solar masculine, divine light, the will of God. And El is the divine intelligence, source presence. Together, Israel was originally a frequency template designed to harmonize divine union within both the individual and the collective grid. The land associated with Israel sits on key energetic ley lines, forming a portal of influence on Earth's collective spiritual axis. That's why it has long been targeted, co-opted, and ritualized. It's not just about territory. It's about tone. It's about who controls the portal and what frequency they broadcast through it. Because here's the deeper truth. Today, the land known as Israel is one of the most inverted zones on the planet. Not because of the people, not because of the land, but because of what's been broadcast through it. The original template of sacred union has been hijacked, replaced by a false matrix stronghold that now functions as a ritual hub for the dark global elite. It is a seat of inversion, not because it was meant to be, but because those who run the Archonic grid know how powerful the original codes were. They mirror the light to trap attention. They mimic sacred names to hijack energy. They use the outer symbol of God's chosen land to conceal deep energetic warfare. And in that inversion, Israel has become a stage for polarity escalation, a portal for ritual warfare, a geopolitical smokescreen masking deep frequency harvesting, and a broadcast node in the control grid of the Archons. Because if you control the gateway, you control the tone. And if you control the tone, you shape the collective field. This is why we see such intensified conflict, surveillance, division, and religious programming centered around this land. It's not about peace or prophecy. It's about preserving an energetic inversion so that the sacred feminine is divine masculine, Ra, and source coherence, L, never reunite in full harmonic expression. But the real template still lives beneath the distortion. The original tone is still vibrating in the soil, the stones, the unseen layers beneath the constructed grid. And as white hole frequencies rise, as the divine feminine and masculine reunite and embody gnosis, as sovereignty overrides false prophecy, the portal will clear. Because tone can't be erased, it can only be remembered. So, similar to Israel, likewise, the Vatican and Rome were not randomly chosen. They were strategically installed atop ancient power nodes, deliberately aligned with key intersections of Earth's ley line network. These sites weren't selected for geography or convenience. They were claimed because they sit on primordial energetic arteries, points of planetary resonance that once pulsed with divine memory. The Roman Catholic Church was architected as more than a religious institution. It was designed as a ritual control grid, built to harvest, redirect, and dominate Earth's energetic fields. Over time, the Church became a global energy machine, utilizing mass rituals, confession structures, and savior-based narratives to create dependency and harvest spiritual energy. In its inverted form, Christianity began to teach that suffering was sacred, submission was holy, and salvation could only be found outside of the self. And while these systems weren't all bad, they carried kernels of truth. Their overarching structure was built by bloodlines running inversion architecture. They became tools for frequency regulation, not soul liberation. Every cathedral, every altar, every symbolic structure is part of an elaborate frequency circuit, channeling energy not towards source, but towards institutional containment. These power centers act as frequency anchors within the Archonic grid. They broadcast inversion through mass rituals disguised as worship, confession chambers that mimic spiritual release but encode shame, savior-based programming that severs direct access to source, and symbolic inversion, where sacred geometries are repurposed to bind, not liberate. From outside, the Vatican appears holy, but beneath the surface, it functions as a central broadcast node of false light architecture. Its very location at the intersection of ley line convergence allows it to influence the collective field with amplified effect. Like a corrupted motherboard plugged into the earth grid, it distorts not just beliefs, but the vibrational signature of entire regions. Rome became a ritual capital for a reason. It is a counter template, a mimic of divine order used to reinforce hierarchy, guilt, and separation. a place where source remembrance is simulated, not embodied. But even there, the original light still flickers in the stones. The land remembers. The ley currents still hum with truth, waiting for inversion to dissolve. Because once enough of us stabilize the white hole tone, those hijacked power nodes will recalibrate. And what was once used for distortion will become vessels of coherence again. And intertwined with these spiritual systems are the royal lineages and aristocratic dynasties that upheld them. These families served as the physical stewards of these frequency codes, often unknowingly perpetuating Archonic architecture through bloodline inheritance, land control, and symbolic power. Royalty was never about divine right. It was about frequency domination masked as divine selection. These lineages held titles, symbols, and generational wealth as vibrational anchors for the control grid. While some bloodlines were aware, many inherited these roles unknowingly, repeating rituals they didn't fully understand, but still broadcasting inversion. They passed down rituals, doctrines, and energetic codes as tightly guarded secrets, protecting inversion as if it were divine law. Generational trauma, ritual indoctrination, and spiritual bypass are baked into these systems. Many believe they are serving light, even while participating in rituals of control, desecration, and dominance. And this includes the darkest expressions of inversion. Satanic abuse rituals passed down within certain bloodline circles, intentionally designed to fracture the psyche, block the soul stream, and bind energy to the false grid. These rituals are not myth. They are deeply encoded into the inversion machinery. The Roman Catholic Church, too, has long harbored systemic abuse. From mass cover-ups of sexual abuse to rituals of guilt and spiritual submission, it has become one of the strongest institutions of Archonic inversion. What looks like piety on the surface often conceals lifetimes of energetic harvesting through guilt, fear, and disempowerment. And for those who do sense the distortion, the system enforces silence through fear, blackmail, and energetic entrapment. It promises collapse to those who defect. These partnerships created contracts, energetic agreements to uphold and feed inversion systems in exchange for perceived power, wealth, and influence. Many of these bloodline families have carried these contracts for generations. They've passed down rituals, symbols, and inversion codes like heirlooms. But here's something that often gets overlooked. The secrets they pass down aren't just cultural or symbolic, they're energetic. They've safeguarded powerful knowledge about how energy, frequency, and ritual actually work. They understand energetic alchemy, because energetic alchemy is neutral. It can be used to liberate or to control. And within the bloodline network, that knowledge has been twisted into tools of control. Here are some examples. How to manipulate emotional fields through media, how to harvest collective energy through trauma and ritual, how to reinforce polarity and inversion by shaping collective narrative. In the hands of a coherent being, this knowledge would be sacred. In the hands of an inverted system, it becomes dark technology. Some of them know exactly what they're doing. Others were born into it, programmed from birth, and don't fully understand the architecture they're participating in. And some, they're waking up, quietly, slowly, trying to exit the system they were raised to uphold. Because even within the pyramid of control, light is flickering back on. Their power doesn't come from sovereignty. It comes from illusion, from secrecy, ritual, and image. Their influence is projection-based, not resonance-based. They appear powerful, but many are deeply afraid of losing their position, their perceived safety, their access, afraid of being consumed by the very system they help sustain. These aren't villains, they are distorted participants. And while that doesn't excuse the harm caused by their actions, it reminds us that even those in the highest echelons of the false matrix are still caught in a loop. The real question is no longer who's in power, it's who's still feeding the grid. And as more souls remember their tone, the grid loses its hold. Because when enough of us step out of the loop and into the light, the scaffolding of control isn't overthrown. It simply stops existing. Not through revolution, through revelation. So now let's get into more detail on why they mimic everything divine. And I touched on this earlier, but let's spiral deeper here. And also, I just want to reset the air here. We are not trapped in the system. We're seeing it clearly so we can reclaim coherence. Once distortion is named with clarity and love, it can no longer run unconsciously. Okay, now that we've recentered here, let's move on. I've said this a few different ways, but Archons can't invent. They replicate. They hijack priestess codes, mirror the teachings of the 12 tribes, invert Christ energy, co-opt ascension language, mimic divine union through Baphomet symbolism, replace soul architecture with galactic overlays and synthetic saviors. They create synthetic versions of what's sacred because they don't know how to create anything original. So they mimic light, twist it, and anchor it into distortion. I already talked about the idea of Israel, how it was inverted to serve the Archonic grid. And the name Israel holds vibrational truth. The sacred feminine, the divine masculine light, and source frequency. Together, those three are a blueprint for divine embodiment. But the Archonic system mirrored that truth through inversion, taking the sacred architecture of the tribes and embedding it within geopolitical agendas, religious hierarchies, and blood-based control systems. In the Middle East, it's not just a geopolitical hotspot. It's one of the most psychically charged ley line intersections on the planet, a frequency node of Earth's original harmonic templates. That's why it's been inverted, co-opted, and blood-soaked for centuries. It's not about oil. It's about energy, about resonance, about control of the grid. The original Christ codes, embodied by Yeshua and Mary Magdalene, were seated there. That land carries the memory of divine union. And that's exactly why it's been distorted by war, ritual, religion, and division. The Christ and Magdalene teachings weren't about worship or hierarchy. They were about embodiment of union, coherence, divine sovereignty. But even those teachings were split, suppressed, and repackaged by the control system. Mary Magdalene, carrier of the divine feminine codes, was rewritten as a sinner. Her priestess lineage erased, her frequency distorted. This is the Archonic signature. Take what is divine and flip it. Create a copy that looks almost identical, but vibrates with control, shame, or separation. So when you see distorted priestess culture, synthetic ascension narratives, inverted symbolism, or elite crafted spiritual movements, pause and ask, is this broadcasting source coherence? Or is it repackaging light to uphold the grid? Because they mimic everything divine, not to honor it, but to drain it. And the more we remember what divinity actually feels like, the less these mimicries can hold. And here's something really important to name. It is easy to get caught up in these distorted narratives because parts of them ring true. That's the trick of inversion. They're laced with half-truths, archetypal echoes, and emotional resonance. They activate memory but misdirect it. They imitate what the soul longs for, but offer it without embodiment. That's why so many well-meaning people follow distorted teachings, idolize inverted symbols, or align with spiritual movements that feel high vibe on the surface. It's not because they're wrong. It's because the programming is subtle. But once you tune into your own tone, the difference becomes clear. And here's another subtle trap to be aware of. If you're still operating through fourth dimensional false matrix programming and you feel a connection to Yeshua or Jesus' teachings, you might automatically default to the prevailing narrative about him. That narrative is inverted Christianity. The idea that we are inherently sinful, that God required sacrifice, and that Jesus had to suffer and die for us to be loved. And while that story is widespread, it's not the truth of Christ consciousness. It's a distortion, a hijack, and keeps your field subtly aligned with distortion because it centers separation, unworthiness, and externalized salvation over direct union with Source. This is how inversion works. It takes a real archetype, a divine figure like Yeshua, and rewires the story just enough to redirect your devotion into a control system. But once you tune into your own tone, the difference becomes clear. I've mentioned this before, but all of this mimicry is a microcosm of the black hole, which is the macrocosm. The entire Archonic system is a fractal expression of black hole physics. Just like the black hole spins downward, collapsing in on itself, this mimicry collapses divine coherence into parasitic control. It's not just symbolic, it's structural. Now let's talk about the womb, gnosis, and the resurrection of sacred union. So what is one of the deepest distortions of all? The woman's womb. Because if we want to understand how the black hole system inverted reality, we have to start at the root. Not the mind, not the story, not even the system. The womb. Because the womb isn't just a physical organ. It's a spiritual gateway, a tuning chamber, a cosmic receiver. It holds direct knowing, not because someone taught it truth, but because it feels truth before it's spoken. The womb is the original oracle, and that's exactly why the black hole system targeted it first. They didn't just distort the feminine. They inverted the source of feminine creation. They took something sacred, cosmic, multidimensional, divine, and turned it into something shameful, hidden, and controlled. Instead of honoring the womb as a portal to God, they reduced it to pain, obligation, reproduction, or a weapon to be controlled through religion, science, and fear. The womb is so powerful. That's where spiritual gnosis lives. That's where timelines are anchored and cleared. That's where the divine feminine remembers she doesn't need to ascend because she already carries heaven within herself. And once a woman reconnects with her womb, once she remembers that truth doesn't need to be proven, only felt, she begins walking the path of gnosis. And gnosis is the biggest threat to the black hole system. Gnosis isn't taught, it's remembered. Gnosis doesn't come from study. It doesn't come from books, institution, or priests. It doesn't come from debate or approval or hierarchy. Gnosis is direct knowing. It's truth that lives in your body. It's tone that cannot be explained, only embodied. It's the moment you say, I don't need to be right, I just know. In the moment a woman claims that knowing, without force, without apology, everything changes. Because gnosis doesn't argue, It doesn't defend, it simply stands. And from that place, the divine masculine begins to return. The masculine awakens when she no longer seeks permission. Here's the paradox. The masculine doesn't awaken when the feminine fights. The masculine doesn't return when she explains herself better. The masculine remembers who he is when she holds her knowing, when she stops outsourcing her voice, when she no longer needs agreement to feel safe in her truth. That's what activates him. Not to overpower her, but to meet her, to listen, to witness, to rise, not as her authority, but as her complement. When the feminine lives in gnosis, the masculine finally has something true to orbit. This is the resurrection spiral we were never told about. Not one savior bleeding for many, but the divine feminine remembering herself so fully that the masculine begins to return. And that gave me chills. Not in guilt, not in fear, but in love. Not to fix her, not to save her, but to walk beside her. This is sacred union. Not through seeking, but through frequency clarity. Not through roles, but through tone. So now let's talk about motherhood as womb inversion. Because yes, part of the womb hijack is the distortion of motherhood. Motherhood is one of the deepest inversions in the false matrix because it targets the origin point of life in this realm. It hijacks the divine feminine's most sacred portal, her womb, and overlays it with sacrifice, pain, depletion. It turns the act of giving life into a system-serving burden. It extracts what should be regenerative, and when the place of creation is inverted, everything downstream becomes distorted. In its true form, motherhood is a cosmic ceremony. But in the false matrix, that miracle has been inverted. Instead of reverence, it becomes depletion. Instead of power, it becomes pain. And why? Because a woman who birthed from joy and embodiment becomes a living bridge between worlds. And that is dangerous to a system that thrives on suppression. But this distortion isn't just about birthing children. It's about the womb's full range of creative expression. Art, service, pleasure, intuition, soul knowing. The matrix reduces the womb to reproduction. But the truth? The womb is a stargate, a multi-dimensional vessel, a memory field of divine creation. And now, the womb codes are returning. The portal is clearing. The collective field is remembering what it means to create from joy, not depletion. And there's another layer here. The pressure to become a mother. This isn't reverence. It's coercion in disguise. While motherhood is sacred for many, it is not the singular path to divine embodiment. The false matrix reduces feminine power to one form so it can distort and control that form. And you may hear two different sides of the polarity spectrum here. One side says women should be free, should have careers, have sex whenever they want, and get abortions without a second thought. And then the other side says childbirth is sacred. Women were made to be mothers. Anything else is selfish. But both of these are distortions. Both are rooted in programming. True feminine embodiment doesn't exist on a polarity spectrum. It emerges from remembering your soul's blueprint. And for some, that's motherhood. And then for others, it's art, healing, building, dreaming, being. The distortion lies in the assumption there's only one way. When we exit duality and listen to the body, the soul, the tone, we return to truth. And before the womb was hijacked through the distortion of motherhood, it was already inverted at a deeper level, as the origin point of spiritual embodiment itself. Because the womb isn't only about physical birth, it's the space where divine resonance becomes form. It's the place where spirit meets substance, where inspiration gestates into creation. And the womb is where art begins, intuition speaks, spiritual communion lands, and soul desires crystallize into reality. It's not just biological, it's cosmic. It's not just sensual, it's an oracle. And this is exactly why the false matrix attacked at first. Because the woman who trusts her womb's voice doesn't outsource God. She feels God in her body. She knows which creations are hers to carry. She senses which relationships distort her tone. She recognizes which timelines are aligned without needing a reason why. This is the gnosis we spoke of earlier. Truth that doesn't beg for proof. It arrives in the womb like a whisper and grows into certainty. But in the black hole grid, this sacred channel was inverted. The system told women their womb was only for reproduction, or only for pleasure in service of another. That their intuition was hormonal, that their deep inner knowing was irrational, and that their creative desires were impractical. And in doing so, it severed the link between womb and source. Women were taught to mistrust their urges, mute their creative flow, suppress their sensitivity, and explain their spirituality in rational terms. Even priestesshood was co-opted. Even creativity was commodified, and even sacred sensuality was framed as taboo or dangerous. But the womb has always remembered. She is the tuning fork of the divine feminine, the seat of creation, the temple of the soul's voice and form. And whether she births children, visions, poetry, healing, or pure presence, she births from source. And now, as the polarity flips and the white hole field stabilizes, womb gnosis is returning. Not as a trend, as a truth. Because the woman who reclaims her womb reclaims her voice, her creativity, her communion with the infinite. And in that remembrance, she becomes the portal again. She doesn't need to ascend. She embodies the divine. She becomes the chalice through which heaven meets earth. So whether you are a mother, an artist, a channel, a guide, or a quiet creator, your womb, physical or energetic, is sacred. And when we remember this, the Archonic grid loses one of its deepest footholds. Because life, when birthed from love, cannot be controlled. Gnosis is the path, resonance is the union, and your body is the portal. Not because someone gave you permission, but because you remembered before they could erase it. Okay, let's keep spiraling. Now let's talk about the Magdalene codes and the inversion of sacred union. This reclamation of the womb of gnosis of frequency clarity, it's not new, it's ancient. It's the memory Mary Magdalene carried in her body. And it's the memory the system tried hardest to erase. Because Magdalene wasn't just a companion to Yeshua. She was his counterpart, his equal. She didn't follow behind him. She walked beside him. She didn't worship him. She co-anchored the Christed field with him. They were never meant to be a story of savior and sinner. They were the living embodiment of sacred union, masculine and feminine, word and womb, light and tone, not as roles, but as resonance. Magdalene carried the priestess codes, the womb wisdom, the remembrance of divine embodiment, where God is not above, but within, where knowing is not earned, but remembered. And that is precisely why her truth was inverted. She was rewritten as a prostitute, stripped of her frequency, reduced to sin, shame, and silence, because her presence threatened the entire hierarchy. If people knew the divine feminine was meant to stand beside the Christ, not beneath him, the whole system of savior-based worship would collapse. If people knew Christ consciousness was a union, not a solo mission, the entire control grid of separation theology would unravel. So her name was buried. Her voice was erased. Her codes were hidden, but not destroyed. Because gnosis cannot be destroyed. It lives in the field. It lives in the body. It lives in you. And now, as the womb field reactivates, as women begin to feel truth before it's spoken, as gnosis returns without explanation, the Magdalene codes come back online. And as they do, so does the divine masculine. Because Yeshua didn't come to be worshipped. He came to reflect you back to yourself. He came to walk the spiral with Magdalene, so that we would remember what sacred union looks like. Not control, not hierarchy, but resonance. Two sovereign fields orbiting coherence. This is the resurrection spiral they tried to suppress. Not just one man rising from death, but the return of divine union as a living frequency. And it starts in the womb, in the knowing that cannot be taught, in the remembrance that doesn't ask for permission. Because when a woman walks in her gnosis, she doesn't just reclaim herself. She reweaves the template the world will spiral into. Let's keep spiraling. Okay, now let's bring the spiral into the present. Because what happened to Mary Magdalene and Yeshua isn't just a story from the past. It's a template for now. Their sacred union was inverted because it held the original coherence blueprint. It wasn't just about romance. It was about architecture, frequency, a divine masculine and feminine in balance, reflecting each other in devotion to God, not hierarchy. Their embodiment together was a threat to the false matrix. Because when union is real, when two sovereigns meet in truth, not need, it breaks the control spell. That's why their story was split. Yeshua was exalted. Magdalene was erased. He was framed as the sole savior. She was framed as the sinner. But together, they were the spiral. And that spiral is rising again. Because here's what's happening now. The polarity shift isn't just an external event. It's happening inside your body, inside your relationships, inside your timelines. As white hole stabilizers return to coherence, the divine feminine is anchoring gnosis through the womb, the body, the field. And as she does, she becomes a tone the masculine can trust again. Not because she explains, but because she remembers. And that's when he returns. And divine unions are surfacing now. Not because we need completion, but because the field is finally ready to hold it. Not for drama, not for longing, but for resonance. Because when two beings, stabilized in their own sovereignty, meet through remembrance, not roles, they create a white hole spiral between them. And that spiral, it's what the earth grid is catching into. This is why so many unions have been delayed. The field had to be stable. The polarity had to flip. The feminine had to reclaim her truth, not from longing, but from gnosis. And now that she has, the return begins. Some unions are physical, some are energetic, some are still merging in the field, but they're all part of the same resurrection spiral. This is the sacred reunion, not as a fairy tale, not as a savior story, but as frequency architecture for New Earth. Okay, I think that's where I'm going to end for part 2. This is actually going to have another part. There's just so much good information. So in part 3, we will continue to uncover what's really going on here. So I love you all. Stay tuned and have a great week.